Well, here we are taking a look at USF2. Now, there are only 5 civilizations or eras in USF2, and I'm going to go through them one at a time, giving you the highlights. Remember, what I'm looking for is the highlights, the most important facts. There's an awful lot of facts in every one of these civilizations documented in the Gombrich textbook, The Story of Art, and in the workbook, and in the videos. But you're not going to write a Victorian novel in this form on each of these. What you're going to do is attempt to pick out the highlights. I'm going to go over the highlights right now to give you a hand. First of all, let's take a look at Byzantium. What was the purpose of art in the Byzantine Empire? Well, it was to tell a religious story to people who couldn't read. Since the church was the organization commissioning the art, they could call the shots on it, and that's pretty much what Pope Gregory had indicated in the 600s, even before the iconoclast controversy occurred. Now the rules. The rules are hand in hand with that purpose. Don't make the image so artful that it distracts from telling the story. The art didn't have to be particularly accurate, it just had to picture people that could be recognized as the main characters in whatever story was being told, and the actions they were taking should tell that story. One technique that you should keep in mind, icons in the Byzantine Empire, and even down to the present day in the Orthodox Church, are revered as images of holy personages, and they're more than just images like pictures printed in a book. They're made in a very careful, loving way. One technique for making them is encaustic. That's where wax is used with pigment embedded in it to paint as if it were paint. Obviously, the wax has to be melted to do this, and then it dries very quickly. It's very permanent in the sense that it doesn't fade, and unless it's heated or subjected to some sort of atmospheric abuse, it would last a long time and retain its brilliance. So encaustic is a technique definitely you have to take note of. It wasn't the only technique used in the Byzantine Empire, but it's the one that we're taking a look at here. Another technique, of course, was mosaics, with little lumps of colored stone or colored glass, sometimes gold foil embedded in the glass. That's another technique that the Gombrich text talks about. And the impact. Well, the impact that we have on the present day, aside from the fact that icons are present even now in Greek Orthodox and Eastern Orthodox churches, is the fact that the iconoclast controversy was essentially over the danger of having images that became objects of worship. And it's a little bit ironic that although iconoclasts lost the battle, that is, they didn't want images in churches, images were permitted in churches and became very popular, their fear was to some degree realized. That is, the fear that the images themselves would be worshipped, although for an outsider it's a little hard to tell whether worship is through the icon or it's actually worshiping the icon itself as some sacred object that can do magic, some sort of a token or a charm. And as I say, perhaps people inside the Eastern Orthodox or Greek Orthodox Church would have an explanation for it of one variety. To the outside observer, it might look as if the image itself is being worshipped. Let's take a look now at Islam. That is, Islamic art and these 4 attributes: the purpose, the rules, the technology, and the impact of the modern day. Once again, just some highlights that I think are of major importance. First of all, what is the purpose of the art of a mosque? It's to decorate the mosque in the appropriate manner. And another purpose of another form of Islamic art, that is illuminated manuscripts of the Quran, are to honor God with illuminations, that is, many different names of God, spelled out in very florid Arabic script, and highly decorated. Some rules for the decoration of the mosque. 3 important rules. You cannot picture people. As Gombrich points out, people don't have any role to play in the hierarchy because there is no hierarchy in Islam. There's you and there's Allah. And there isn't any hierarchy of priests or officials as you have in the Catholic Church. There are no people to be pictured. You're not going to picture Muhammad, and you're not going to picture Allah. So there are no people pictured in the decorations of a mosque. Arabic calligraphy for various prayers or the name of Allah is very popular, and geometric patterns, sometimes called arabesques, are also very popular and highly developed in Islamic art. The art also is sometimes constructed of ceramic tiles, paints, glass, textiles, and manuscripts decorated or illuminated with gold leaf and paints depicting adulatory names of Allah. Now, what is the impact? Well, the impact, one of the major impacts, is mosques even today follow these same rules. These rules were originated perhaps as early as 700 AD, and the same rules still apply. Now, we haven't talked here about a lot of other types of Islamic art or secular Islamic art. There are some examples in the Gombrich text. In secular examples, that is, non-religious texts, non-religious writings, if Muhammad is pictured, he's pictured with a veil over his face, because his face is never pictured as an image. It's a grave assault on the dignity of Muhammad, as far as Islam is concerned, to attempt to picture his face. And that's one reason they take very serious offense if anybody does that, even in jest. We take just a very brief look at China in the story of art. Not really much of a look at all. There are some illustrations of funerary art from an early era, and also some pictures of statuary that have a lot of curves and very swerving shapes to them. And that's curving and swerving sorts of images are also present in some of the art. Some of the highlights, though, what you need to really think about is the purpose of the scrolls that are pictured in the story of art. One of the major purposes is meditation. As Gombrich points out, these scrolls weren't hung up as artwork to be admired. Many times they were rolled up and only unrolled when a period of real thoughtfulness was to be enjoyed, meditation. Scrolls were composed of ink drawn on silk, and some of these scrolls had a moralizing characteristic to them, that is, saying what the relationship between a husband and wife should be, and others were scenes of landscapes that were imagined and were an attempt to put your mind at some other place, to take your mind off whatever you might have been thinking of and enter into some state of meditation. An important characteristic of art in China at the time was that, unlike the case with artists or craftsmen in other areas of the world, like Europe, where the craftsman was regarded as a tradesman, we would call them blue-collar because they got their hands dirty, not an intellectual. In China, the person who created the art was thought to be a visual poet, somebody who was an intellectual, and the art was regarded on that plane, and the person creating it was regarded on that plane. Symmetry was not very important. In fact, it wasn't stressed at all. An illustration of three fishes swimming in a circle is certainly not symmetric, as illustrated in the Gombrich text. It actually comes across almost in an animated way, with the fish in very realistic positions of swimming. Symmetry was not something that was cherished or highly regarded or even attempted very much in Chinese art of the period. In later Western art, symmetry was also abandoned as a criteria for the way that art should be formed. But at the same time in the Middle Ages, around 1000 AD, symmetry was a very big deal in art. It was thought that you had to balance things along some center line or some type of line drawn through a mirror image on the other side of it, that the picture wasn't balanced unless that occurred. But that was not a criteria in Chinese art. Let's take a look at post-Roman Europe. What this means is Europe from about 500 or 600 AD to about, maybe 1200 AD, the Dark Ages. Post-Roman because the Roman Empire had collapsed, and various other types of arrangements for governing localities were in place. The feudal system, where peasants farmed the land and owed the landowner a portion of their crops in exchange for protection by that aristocratic landowner, who may have had knights at his command and people to otherwise defend the area that he held from outside invaders. Much more localized in terms of the way things were governed than with the Roman Empire and its very centralized structure in Rome. Here, art was also used to tell religious stories for people who couldn't read. And once again, the goal was not to attain beauty or realism in the art. It was simply to tell the story. So realism and shape and position is not important. Also, artists had to follow patterns. There were definite ways that people expected to see certain saints pictured, certain ways they were supposed to be dressed, certain positions they had, and you'll see several examples in the Gombrich text of this. Now, some artistic influences did permeate Europe from invaders from the north, and you'll see some examples of that also, and especially in terms of insular art, that is, the art of the British Isles. As I mentioned a bit earlier, symmetry became an important criteria in this era. So a picture would be balanced with having the same number of people on the left or the right or the top or the bottom. Also, pictures became kind of an aggregation of things to tell a story, even if all the things weren't related in the same time and place. The story of a saint's life, for example, might be illustrated all in one illustration with a lot of different scenes crowded together. The idea was to tell a story in that way. Now, handwritten manuscripts were also important at this time. The Bible was being copied by hand and many times decorated with something that you'll discover in Project 2, historiated initials, capital letters that are made very florid and colorful to decorate the page, or other forms of decoration, leafy things and some sort of geometric patterns. You'll see a lot of geometric patterns in the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels, which are shown in the videos associated with Unit 2. The impact, well, significant concepts like symmetry tended to persist in Western art all the way through to the 1800s. You'll see that in much of the art of the Renaissance, the same sort of symmetry, the same kind of balance, although later in the Renaissance the balance is achieved not by two of the same type of figure, but by blocks of color, offsetting on one side and balancing a large shape on the other side of a painting. Symmetry is one of the most important things that came about in this era as a criteria for the formation of art. And finally, let's take a look at the Gothic era, around 1100 to 1300, an era of cathedral building. And the fact that cathedrals were being built with a new type of architecture to display stained glass windows is really important. It's a major impact here. Once again, the purpose of the art, commissioned by the church, was to tell a religious story in a simple way. But by this time, some other things started to apply. Stained glass, which is glass that's manufactured with minerals added to it to color it, in many cases, the color took on a special significance. For example, reds and blues were associated with holy figures. They were given capes or clothing of that color, sort of mimicking what happened in the Roman Empire, where purple was a royal color. Some of the earliest art in the Byzantine era, you might find that Jesus is given clothing or a cape of purple. Later on, in stained glass windows, blue or red might be associated with the holy figure. If realism conflicts with telling the story, or if the story is better told in a simple way, then realism is sacrificed. It wasn't anything to be aimed at as far as the commissioners of the art, the church, felt. Now, a given artist might want to try something different, but they were very much constrained in how their art would be accepted if it didn't follow the established pattern. As Gombrich mentions, there were pattern books, that is, examples of how certain things were to be drawn. And you had to keep pretty much in keeping with those patterns, or the art was not regarded as legitimate. Egg tempera, which is a binder of egg yolk mixed with a powdered pigment, became very popular in this era, and it was highly developed in terms of how artists would use it. It does dry pretty fast, and it's more opaque than oil as a binder, but oil hadn't been tried out yet as a binder for paints. So egg tempera and its limitations was very popular and widely used. Small batches of paint had to be mixed up. You couldn't mix up an awful lot of it because it would dry. And as a result, sometimes when large areas had to be painted with the same color, there's kind of a splotchy effect because it's very difficult to mix two batches of egg tempera paint and get the shade exactly the same. stained glass became a very big number in the Gothic era. Stained glass, that is, pictures formed of pieces of glass that are held together by lead shaped like a letter H, so it has a groove in each side for glass pieces to fit in, and the whole fitted into a frame. In order to light up the inside of a church with very colorful light from outside, stained glass windows were mounted in openings in walls. However, Romanesque architecture was very fortress-like. It had to have very thick walls, and it used circular arches. In the Gothic era, architects developed a way of taking the massive nature of the walls and sort of spreading it out by having what were called flying buttresses. These were large weighted columns set outside a church wall, and then an arch connecting that outside support to the church wall to buttress it. These were called flying buttresses. The weight of the roof pushing down on the wall, the force would be channeled out towards the external supports, and that meant the wall itself didn't really have to take all of the force that was acting on it by the roof. So the wall still supported what was above it, but it didn't have to have the extra bulk in order to support the outward pressure of the roof bearing down and attempting to spread the walls apart. That spreading was resisted by the flying buttresses and the large column weight that were external to the building. The net effect of this is the walls could be opened up a great deal more, and in those openings was placed large stained glass windows. So both flying buttresses as an architectural technique and stained glass are very important in the Gothic era, the technology of the flying buttresses and the technology of the stained glass. What is the impact of Gothic architecture on the modern world? Well, stained glass is still very popular. Even newly constructed churches and synagogues use stained glass. It's associated with that form of building, probably because it's very elegant and it can be very colorful with the outside light playing on it to light up the inside of a structure. It makes the inside of that kind of a structure a special place. And it has persisted in its use since the Gothic era, where it was pioneered. And that's what I think is important for you to know for USF2.